I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Editing Podcast. This week we're delighted to welcome a special guest, our friend and colleague, Hester Higton.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Hester. We've been talking about doing this for ages, so it's brilliant that we've finally gone and done it.
Eventually, after we put it off for so long. So why were we so keen to get Hester on the podcast? Well, it's because she's a hugely experienced editorial professional with over 20 years' experience of academic editing.
And she's worked with some big name publishers like Cambridge University Press, Yale University Press, British Museum and the Royal Society, but also directly with academic authors too. So she's seen things from all sides.
Yeah, so today we're going to focus on academic editing, but also look out for the other 2 episodes in which we'll chat with Hester about efficient editing and assessing a non-fiction project.
And so that everyone listening has an idea of what to expect today, we're just going to go through what we're going to be covering. First, the route from academia to editing, then how editors support academics, and after that what skills you need, what specific skills you need.
Yeah, and then we'll chat about training, the different types and sources of clients, what academic voice is, and some of the issues that editors are facing around ethics and, of course, AI.
Yeah, so let's get cracking. Now, there are many routes to editing, and we love chatting with other editors about this because it's always a great reminder that this isn't a one-size-fits-all job. So, Hester, can you tell us a little bit about your journey from being an academic to an editor?
Sure. So I trained as a historian of science, and then I worked in various museum positions after I finished my PhD. But after that, as for so many working mums, I found that holding down a full-time job didn't fit with my family commitments. I see you nodding about that.
Yeah. Yep. We know.
At the same time, I was thinking that academia might not be the right fit for me. I really enjoy teaching, as you'll know from the courses I run on editing. And the investigative side of research is fun, but I struggle with writing. If it's not perfect the first time I put something down on paper, I just can't find the right mindset to rework it. Yeah. However, what I had discovered even back then was that I didn't have the same problem helping other people to improve their work.
That's like you, Denise.
Hester, that's so funny. That's just, we have this same dynamic. I'm very like you. Louise, she'll bash anything out at a minute's notice. She loves that writing process, but we've always said that I've got this sort of fear of the blank page and it's not going to be right, so how do I start? So, totally with you there. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And on top of that, I do have an eye for detail. I guess it fits with the kind of research I enjoyed and the museum work I took on. Lots of nitty-gritty cataloguing and so forth. Mm-hmm. Plus, I had the bonus of some experience already of proofreading because I helped my dad with proofs of his own academic books when I was growing up.
Well, hang on a minute, because I used to help my dad cutting the grass. This is a whole new insight into another world. Nice one, Hester.
How old were you when you started doing that?
5.
I wasn't that young. I probably must have been sort of 10 or 11, I think.
Oh, wow.
Very old, yeah.
Wow.
And it wasn't. Gosh. It was mostly checking index proofs for him, that he would want to read out the page numbers and I'd check them against the information on the index. But basically the sorts of things that when people used to be starting out as proofreaders at publishers, that's the kind of thing they do, wasn't it?
They would do that, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So all in all, becoming a freelance editor seemed like a really good move. And here I am, 2 decades on. So obviously it was.
Absolutely. I think you made the right move there, Hester.
Yeah, but can I just say, my grass is fantastic.
You can come and do mine then. Now, another important issue, especially for any academic writers or new academic editors, is understanding what's on the table when it comes to editorial services. So Hester, can you tell us what kind of support academics should be expecting from their editors?
Okay, I'm going to use one of Denise's favourite phrases. It depends. See, I do listen to the podcast.
Love it.
Yeah, the ways in which editors work with academics are really varied. At the most hands-off level, everything will go through a publisher client. The publisher approaches an editor who they think will be a good fit for the project. The editor does the work and hands it back to the publisher, and that's the last you hear of it. Now, I don't really like that approach because I want to be able to have a conversation with the author. I want to understand where they're coming from and to make sure that I'm hearing their voice correctly. So thankfully, it's more common, even when the process goes through a publisher, that the editor is put in direct contact with the author, which I find works out better in lots of ways. It means that you can smooth out all the issues with the text and present a really clean final version to the publisher. And that means far fewer problems at proof stage.
Yeah.
Hester, that's a really interesting point that you made there, because when I first started out in our industry, I was a pure proofreader. And when you're working for publishers, that's often, it's very rare to be in direct contact with the author at that stage. And I don't know if that's still the case because I don't work with publishers anymore. But so that's interesting that you were in that different space where you were able, even though you were still working with publishers, you're still able to have that direct contact often.
Yeah, it makes it much more of a collaboration rather than just being purely transactional, doesn't it?
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, and I think that the publishers who do use that realise that it works better for them. It saves them time and money as well.
There's value for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think sometimes they can be a bit precious about the process and they don't want... It's almost like they don't want you spending too much time by yourself with the author. They don't trust you. But sometimes
they maybe only see the negatives of that rather than the positives.
Yeah, they worry about
usually that way.
Version confusion and things like that. And and they need to trust me that I can handle that. So.
Yeah, I think editors are fairly good at version control, providing people let them do what's sensible, don't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what I enjoy most is when the author comes directly to me. That means there's so much more space to have a conversation about exactly what they're hoping to achieve and to tailor the support I give them accordingly. So, sorry, I've gone a bit away from your question. What kind of support should academics expect from their editors? Well, it does depend on what I've just said about how the contact is set up between author and editor. If the academic approaches me directly, then I'll probably be helping them to hone their argument so that it puts their message across effectively. That might involve some suggestions for developmental or structural work, as well as the more straightforward line and copy editing. Now, quite often the project will be in good shape. Academics get a lot of training in how to write as they're moving up through their profession and how to present a narrative. So it's rare for big problems to arrive, though they do crop up occasionally. Even so, it's not unusual for repetition to creep in or for previous drafts to have been moved around so much that the logic of the argument falls apart in places.
Hester, can I ask you something? I was just wondering if, when you're working directly with academics who have had, they feel quite experienced in their writing abilities, are they always receptive to being edited, or do you ever have situations where you have to kind of help them get into the groove of being edited? Because it can be quite a shock.
They're not always receptive, no, but actually the really interesting thing now I come to think about it is that every time I've worked directly with an author, when they've come to me, they have been. It's when I've had material come via a publisher that I get much more pushback.
Because they're already in the mindset of like, I've wanted to get in touch with this person.
Yeah.
So, that it makes sense that I'm going to be receptive to the process. I'm going to be edited. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe some who go through a traditional publisher are maybe more inclined to think, my writing's fine. Why is this person being put into the process here?
Yeah, I've presented my finished product to the publisher. That should be all I need to do.
Yeah. They might not have had the publishing process explained to them, whereas it's more likely perhaps that someone who's going at their own has already been thinking about these different stages. So yeah.
And you do also get the or both ends of the spectrum. You get the very young academics who are insecure and who just don't want anybody else to handle their stuff. And then you get the ones who've been doing it for 40 years and think they know it all And so, don't you dare, I'm very important and you mustn't alter my text in any way.
Yeah. They're more likely to be embedded in maybe outdated language, and I'm doing air quotes, rules, and less open to the idea that so many more things are actually style choices and that sort of thing, that they're, two spaces after a period don't start a sentence.
Just like we'll be in 20 years' time, because every generation...
things coming behind us that we don't know about, they're definitely going to catch us out in the future, I'm sure.
Anyway, sorry about that, Hester, I interrupted you.
Yeah, so that's if they come directly to me. If the contact comes via a publisher, then often the book is at a later stage because it's been accepted for publication. And I'm far more likely to be focusing on the line and copy editing. And that's particularly true if it's a journal article with a short turnaround. There's no time to do anything else. When I can, I will check things up directly with the author. But as I've said, that's not always possible. And therefore, what I would say to authors is that if your publisher tends to favour the no contact between author and editor approach, do push back against it and say that you'd appreciate being able to discuss the work directly with your editor. The author has more clout to say that than the editor does, because after all, the publisher knows they have a vested interest in the publication.
Yeah, definitely.
I have one final point, and that relates to working with authors whose first language is not English. I really take my hat off to them. I cannot believe how they manage to put across a fluent argument in a language that's not their mother tongue.
It is impressive, isn't it?
But they will inevitably often need more support with sentence structure and paragraph flow, and particularly in finding idiomatic ways of presenting their argument. Idiom is such a delicate thing to get right, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so difficult to learn as well, yeah.
So in that case, I may well be unpicking the structure of a paragraph and putting it back together again, so that it reads more naturally and doesn't jar the reader out of the thread of the argument.
Yeah, that's really interesting points, the difference between the type of work depending on how it arrives on your desk.
It is, isn't it?
Might be, you'd still, it's all academic editing, but there's different routes into it. Yeah,
and you just won't know until you look at the file what kind of attention it needs.
So in order to provide all that support, we editors need to know what we're doing. We're going to talk more about the training options in a moment. But first, Hester, can you tell us what kinds of skills a person needs to be an academic editor specifically?
Well, almost all academic editors come from an academic background, and that's a great start to have. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a PhD, but you do need to have some understanding of how academics think and write in general. And that's something that you'll pick up through a degree course, particularly one where you're required to read a lot of academic papers and books. That kind of reading immerses you in the conventions of academic writing. Things like how notes and references are used, and the sort of tone of voice that's common. And then, as with all non-fiction editing, it's vital to be able to make sure that the structure of the argument works. But those arguments can be a lot more complex than in general non-fiction, and so you need to keep a clear head and be prepared to work very slowly through tricky paragraphs to make sure that you fully understood them, especially if you're editing something like philosophy.
I used to proofread philosophy, and that was tricky enough. I can't imagine editing it. I mean, I don't have a degree in philosophy, but I do have a degree in politics, so I had I'd had some exposure to political philosophy anyway, and that's it's interesting, isn't it, how depending on the different subjects, the pressures that might come your way.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. And at the same time, it's so important not to lose sight of the fact that this is the author's book, and that their voice needs to be respected and not tinkered with for the sake of tinkering. As always, of course, when editing, we all know that.
Yeah, first rule.
I'd say the one biggest issue that separates academic texts from others is the references. There will be hundreds of notes and references in most books, and it's not uncommon to rack up more than 100 even in an article, especially in humanities subjects. I had one just the other week which had more than 200 in it, I think, in a 12,000 word article. And that was a bit over the top. But
that is.
So you need to have an incredible eye for detail and the ability to follow a client's style guide to the letter, or to the punctuation mark, and not to get confused with another style that's very similar but not the same.
And also patience, because that kind of work you've just talked about, that reference checking and or citation checking, it's quite painstaking work, isn't it? Again, I remember this from my proofreading, social science proofreading days, and if you can't get into the zone with it, you're going to struggle with it, and then you're going to miss things. So you have to, it's kind of a mindset thing, isn't it?
I love it. I love working on reference lists. And sometimes that's all I do for a client is just sort out their references.
Really?
That's what did one quite recently. Just wanted APA 7 for the references. It's just like, roll the sleeves up, get multiple screens out. Great.
And Denise, do you love that bit when you think, oh, that's not the right information, and you rush off to check and you fill in the correct stuff when you feel so good?
Absolutely. I had one client last year, I worked with her for a couple of years, and I was so deep, Louise knows this, so deep in the National Archives and the Margaret Thatcher Foundation archives. I was just like absolutely loving it, how far you could go in to get the right information. She was paying me for that, it was not unpaid work, but I find it so rewarding when it's like, yes, I found it. This is what she was asking me for, and I found it. Very rewarding.
Yeah, yes. I've got an anecdote along those lines, but it's not really relevant, so maybe I shouldn't drop it in.
Oh, go on, drop it in, and then if we get to the end of the anecdote and we say, no, that was completely irrelevant, we'll get it edited out.
So I was working on the second edition of a book not very long ago, and there was a quote from Voltaire, and it wasn't very well referenced, so I was trying to hunt down the reference, as I would normally do. I think, I'm really struggling to find this, and the only place it seems to be referenced is in the first edition of this book.
Oh, no.
And eventually I did identify it from, I can't remember, it was from one of his letters rather than from his works, or vice versa, something like that. So I put the right reference in, finally. And what I had noticed in the meantime was that other people had cited that quote from the first edition of the book I was working on. So it's been cited incorrectly for about a decade.
Oh, no. All over the place.
All over the place. Now it's correct.
Citation. Yeah, you need to go to the second edition for the correct citation.
So anyone listening, when you see that citation, that's our Hester did that. Made sure that was right.
Yeah.
But I do love those sorts of rabbit holes and getting things right.
Yeah, get right far into them. It's great fun. Yeah. Some people are listening to this probably thinking, I can't think of anything worse.
Some people are probably listening to this thinking, I thought about listening to this because I'm thinking about being an academic editor. Now I'm not.
Now I know for sure if that's what I have to do or not. Okay then, so we've identified what you actually need to be able to do. So Hester, what guidance do you have for our listeners about how they should go about acquiring those skills?
Well, obviously you need to have some standard editorial training under your belt. Mm-hmm. It's especially important within that to get a good grasp on how to handle illustrative materials. So that's graphs and tables as well as images, and how to deal with notes and references, because all of those things come up very often in academic work.
Yeah.
And the Chartered Institute of Editing and Proofreading has a very thorough e-learning course on references, which will be helpful here, as will its course on querying, because academic projects almost always generate hundreds of queries, and finding the right tone for putting those across to authors is a real art. Remember what we were saying previously about precious authors, and you have to pitch it correctly if you want to make sure they're receptive to your suggestions.
And actually, that course would be relevant to any field.
Yeah.
Because as soon it doesn't, whatever the subject matter is, whether it's academic or legal or fiction, showing respect and giving your writer dignity and is critical.
Yeah.
The Publishing Training Centre has modules on both those subjects too, as well as one on editing illustrations. So that's some places to start.
What we'll do, Hester, is we'll put links to all of them in the show notes so people can look up the show notes for more information on all of these courses you've mentioned.
If you're likely to be working with authors whose first language is not English, then investing time in training that helps you to communicate with them and to identify common issues in their writing will set you up well. And if you can find information that tells you about the particular issues that authors from particular countries struggle with, that can be really helpful too. So knowing, for instance, that people from the Far East don't use articles and therefore put them in randomly.
Yeah.
And that's just because they don't have them in their languages. So being aware of those kinds of tics that are likely to appear, or there will be words that don't translate as you'd expect them to.
They have false friends where they think, false friends, yeah.
So people will translate them as what they think they should be, and you'll be thinking, hang on, that doesn't mean that at all. What were they trying to say? And you might end up actually then using a translate to retranslate it back into their language, think, oh, they meant that.
Yeah, a bit of detective work sometimes, isn't it? Yeah.
And then a course in developmental editing will provide you with the opportunity to market yourself to authors who need major help to prepare their projects for publication. Again, the CIEP runs one of those. Finally, nothing replaces reading widely in the subject areas that you're interested in working in. Obviously, some of that comes automatically through the projects that you take on, but it's worth taking time to identify and study examples of academic writing that you know is done well, because you will reap so many benefits from that source, just learning by example.
Yeah, it's the same principle that, Louise, you would probably give, the same advice you would give to fiction editors, is read widely in your genres so that you understand the tropes and the language and the tones and things like that.
The readers' expectations about, the way things are expressed, or not I don't mean actually at sentence level, but just more their kind of expectations about the way a text feels. Because, again, from my proofreading background, I remember that the register of some of the philosophy books I was proofreading was very different from the economic ones.
Yeah.
And that was fine, because that was
it's expected.
That was expected by readers and publishers. So that's a really, really good tip though, Hester. Again, as Denise said, just to and apply that generally, even if you decide not to go down the academic editing route. So so someone's identified the necessary skills for academic editing, carried out the appropriate training. Now for the elephant in the room, because being skilled up doesn't mean work magically lands on your lap. So Hester, who might academic editors work for, and how might they go about finding those clients and getting in front of them?
If you don't mind my saying so, that sounds like marketing might just be rearing its ugly head during this part of the conversation.
Not ugly to us, never ugly to us.
Not to us. Not that we hardly ever talk about marketing, do we?
Well, I've talked a bit earlier on about the sorts of clients you might be working for. Most academic editors will work for a mix of clients, for publishers, for packagers, sometimes for universities, and often directly with the authors themselves. And inevitably, they all require different approaches. For publishers and packagers, you can try the cold calling or emailing approach. But if you're doing that, do make sure that you've identified the right people to talk to and be specific about what you can offer. Decide which subjects you're comfortable to work in. That might be the degree subject that you took and things in related fields. And target those departments at the presses. At universities, there'll often be a unit that provides writing support for staff and students. If there is, it's worth finding out whether they keep a list of suitable freelancers and whether you can be added to their books. And then individual authors may well find you online, so of course make sure that your website and any directories you're registered in show that you're happy to take on academic clients and what the subjects are that you can cover for them.
That's just a really good example, Hester, of there are lots of different streams of potential sources of work in academic editing, and it's just a case of, like with any other area, doing the detective work and a bit of investigation to find out where your best options are, whether that's, like you say, a university or a student writing support centre, or directly with academic publishers. There are lots of options out there, and some people may not suit working with all of these options, but I think, like anything, it's good to sort of spread your options across a few
And
different
actually,
sources.
that what you both have been talking about there, about identifying exactly where in the institution you're targeting, who to go to, who to ask if you want to get on that bank of freelancers. And the fact that might involve a little bit of detective work might encourage some people, because as soon as we often find in our industry that as soon as there's probably more people in our industry of freelance editing who don't like marketing than do like it. And I sometimes think if you can consider it a research project,
Yes.
then it's I'm not really doing marketing. I'm actually just discovering who these core people are in this and what their roles are within this space. But before you know it, you've got a list of 10 people who you can write to and ask and find out if you're suitable for them. So bit of
reframing
there, isn't it? Yeah.
Bit of reframing.
Yes.
A bit of reframing.
It's so good for all those people like me who hate marketing. Yeah. And I have to put my hand on my heart here and say, I don't do very much marketing myself. And I do have a website and I have an entry in the CIEP directory, of course. But I've just had some really lucky breaks along the way. When I started out, my first offers of work came via people I knew. And those initial projects led to new ones with the same publishers or with friends or colleagues of the authors and so on. And it just kept going through the years.
Yeah.
So what I'd say from that is do cultivate the contacts you already have if you want to go into academic editing. If you're coming out of a job in academia, keep in touch with your colleagues and see if they want help with upcoming projects. Or consider attending subject specialist conferences and talking to people there about your new line of work. I think that perhaps even more than in other lines of editing, it's all about networking.
I think that's such a good point, Hester. I think sometimes newer editors coming out of academia, surprisingly to me, they don't often think about their existing network as a source of clients. It's almost like some people have the mindset, I'm starting a new type of job, so I'm starting from scratch, when actually you've actually got a built-in network there already, which other new proofreaders or editors would be begging for,
Right.
You've got those contacts there, so make the most of them.
Because people who are coming in from a totally different background won't necessarily know anybody who wants to publish a book. And yet,
exactly.
An academic will have queues of colleagues who have books.
But that's, I suppose, another aspect to this, because there will be people listening to this who will be sliding or looking to slide into academic editing or a type of academic editing, even though they haven't come from academia, even as like a practicing academic. And those people are going to be facing competition from those who went down Hester's route, who've got that network, who've got those contacts. So all I'm saying is that the world has changed a bit since the three of us first went into this line. There's a lot more global competition now because of websites and the content available on the internet. So I just think people need to be aware that you might find that it's a more competitive environment than it was 20, 30 years ago. Well, no, not might. You are going to find that just because. And so think about the different types of marketing you can do, even because the other flip side of this is that there are people like Hester, you, for example, who don't like doing content marketing, which is ironic since you're on a podcast doing content marketing in effect, but you've snuck yourself into a marketing thing accidentally. So for people who don't have networks, that academic colleagues or colleagues who are going into editing who've got those academic networks, think about other things that you can do to make yourself visible, and content marketing might be a very good way, because there's so many people don't want to do it.
Plug for content marketing alert. Thank you, Louise.
Well, no, it's just that, I know that there will be people listening to this who aren't. There will be people who are going to come into this in exactly the way Hester did, with that kind of background experience, but there are going to be people who aren't, and everybody's, even if they're not doing copy editing or line editing or structural editing, they might be coming into it from a proofreading perspective. And there is a market for people, who might still be able to acquire the skills that and the mindset that Hester was talking about earlier, but need to have a different way of approaching it that doesn't rely on networking and an academic background. And there are other options.
Yeah. I mean, I do some academic editing, but it's unrelated to my undergraduate degree. It's nothing to do with physiotherapy, as it happens. Sometimes I've done theses that are kind of roughly aligned with that, but I've got it through other routes, like you say, from marketing, by networking with people and being available to take on work that other people couldn't do at short notice, and then that gets your foot in the door, and then all of a sudden they're giving you repeat work. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to approach that. Yeah.
But I suppose there's just one final thing to say on marketing, and that is whatever routes that you choose, you must do something.
Yeah, it's not going to just land in your lap, is it?
No.
Unless you're really, really, really lucky.
Because even Hester, who doesn't like
Still
marketing,
talking about marketing.
even Hester, who doesn't like marketing, then went down the networking line, which is marketing.
It is, yeah. And I'd also say be open to doing something that's outside your comfort zone sometimes.
Yeah.
And say, I'm not sure how I feel about doing that project, but I'll have a go, because it'll open another door for you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I actually, I've got a little story about that, because I used to work for a publisher years ago, again, when I was an academic, social sciences proofreader, and the client asked me, a publisher asked me to do some legal proofreading, and I said, I don't think so. I think you need a lawyer for that, don't you? A former lawyer? And she said, not necessarily for proofreading. Sometimes it can come in handy, but sometimes there's various things. So you might start by proofreading in certain academic subject areas, and then if you do that area a lot, you might actually feel that you've got the skills and immersion in the material to slip into copy editing.
Yeah, definitely. Be open. I think it's a good piece of advice there. Yeah. So Hester, let's get back to academic editing, and we'll park the marketing chat just for a bit, okay? So we hear in Louise's kind of work, which is fiction, that people they're talking about voice all the time. But really, it's just as relevant for academic writing and editing too, isn't it? So can you tell us a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely, it's relevant. There are particular styles that are peculiar to academic writing, and some of them are just that, peculiar. Of course, when you're writing for an academic audience, a formal approach is important. So really colloquial writing should be avoided. Any editor will be tending to take out all those contractions like don't and can't and she'd and all the rest of it, because it sounds too informal for the audience. But many academics go too far in the other direction. And I'd say that that's rooted in a particular form of academic voice that became popular in the 20th century. And it essentially suggested that setting yourself apart from the subject matter made the content more objective.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
People shied away from using personal pronouns and put everything into the passive voice. They didn't own that this was their research. If they had to talk in the first person, they'd often resort to saying we, even if there was only one writer. So
like
we will
show
you that. And at the same time, there was a huge tendency to overcomplicate text with florid sentence structure and polysyllabic words, which may make the author sound terribly important, but it really obscures the message.
Yeah. I think also, I don't know if you found this as well with writers for whom English isn't their first language. They've often been taught even just regular English in that quite formal register, quite florid, and using complex language where it's really not necessary.
Absolutely.
And also, that's a cultural thing sometimes, isn't it? So it's like kind of then
you reflective a different English,
a different English, and also like who's it's the dominant, that Western dominance sort of setting its cards on the table and saying our way is the right way.
Yeah,
we don't do florid,
and that's actually a really important point when it comes to working with authors from global majority heritage backgrounds, because it's not just that they're doing that because they think it's what we want. it's because, very unfortunately, the people who assess the manuscripts that they present will look at the information about them, especially if their name sounds like it's from one of those backgrounds, and will set the bar higher. So they will expect them to write in this tone, and if they don't, if they write simply, then they'll get turned down. And I think that's a dreadful, dreadful situation.
What, you mean so they're penalised for using plain language, almost?
Yes.
Yeah. They have to demonstrate their mastery of the language.
That's it.
By using complicated structures.
Yeah.
And advanced vocabulary where, you know, why use if you can use utilise, that sort of thing. You know, it's
So you do have to be very careful when you're advising that strand of author.
Because non-white people are facing very different demands and expectations on them. They have to work that much harder to get the same, to be judged the same way. So it's all very well. It's all very well as us as three white women guiding our authors on this or that, but actually, you know, we can't put ourselves in those shoes. The best we can do is empathise, but we can't know what that's like. And so that's a really good point, Hester. You have to be really careful about the kind of guidance you're giving.
That said, if you're working with people who are from a Western cultural background who have that kind of security, then you can work with them to say, look, you don't have to obfuscate your argument with all of this flowery language and sentences that go on for 300 words. My husband is an academic. It runs in our family and all over the place. And the advice that he gives his students is always the same. Write in as simple a way as the subject matter allows, using both simple words and simple sentence structure. If you've got a good argument, you don't need to dress it up. It's just there in the argument. And yes, you might need to use some technical language if that's part of the vocabulary of your subject. But you don't need to go beyond that and start talking about hermeneutics when you've actually got no idea what hermeneutics are, but you think it sounds clever. As simple as the subject matter allows. So that's really good advice. And when I can, I encourage authors to work like that.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Something that often pops up in editing chat is that of ethics. Hester, what do you think are the main ethical issues that academic editors and writers, for that matter, need to be thinking about as part of their practice?
Well, the biggest thing that comes to mind is plagiarism. Academic authors are certainly not immune from it, and perhaps they're even more susceptible than other authors because there's a real pressure on them to be publishing frequently, and so sometimes they cut corners. Of course, quotations from other authors are covered by fair usage in copyright law as long as they're properly acknowledged. But sometimes material will simply be lifted without permission or acknowledgement at all. And sometimes, again, this is going back to talking about different cultures, you need to be aware of those cultural pitfalls in that authors from some countries are unaware of what is and isn't acceptable in publishing in English-speaking countries. And you may find yourself needing to gently educate them in those cases and say, no, I'm sorry. Any time that you cite another author, you do need to acknowledge where that material has come from. It needs to be in quotes. It needs to have a reference. But they may not be used to working that way.
I think in my understanding, in some cultures, like you say, Hester, it's actually seen as being respectful and honouring somebody to use their work. And they don't necessarily think about crediting them for it in the same way that we do with our citations.
Now, plagiarism from another author is usually fairly easy to spot because the style of writing will change when material has been lifted from somewhere else. And occasionally you'll find yourself moving the mouse across the page and, there's a hyperlink here that's been hidden in the text, and you click on it and there, lo and behold, you're on the Wikipedia page and it's all been copied from there. I have had that happen to me.
I've done that. I've seen that as well, and also the spaces between words with the little. It's the
non-breaking space.
The non-breaking spaces.
Yes.
Text lifted from websites. It's a fairly dead giveaway. As soon as you show hidden characters, it's there for all to see, isn't it?
What's much harder to spot is self-plagiarism. So that's where an author has not acknowledged taking material from something that they have previously published, no doubt with another publisher.
That's a tricky one, isn't it? Because sometimes if you've got knowledge in your own head or on it's part of your own framework, saying it again I mean, are you talking about sort of paraphrasing something, or
No,
are you actually talking about literally copying and pasting something
literally
from your...
lifting?
Right. Yeah.
And they think because they've written it, it's okay to do that.
Yeah, they don't need to cite it. I'd like to cite myself.
They're your ideas, so you can regurgitate them as many times as you like, as long as you don't use the same words.
Yeah.
Or you might want to have a general acknowledgement to say material in this chapter draws heavily on previously published works that are these. I had this happen really recently to me. I think I was chasing up a quotation that didn't seem quite right. There was a word that wasn't working in it, and found that quotation in the author's previously published work. And I was looking around and thinking, oh, hang on, this sounds terribly familiar. And I had to go back and so I completed the project and sent it back to the client and said, by the way, the author has self-plagiarised. And guess what? He went away, he rewrote 2/3 of the book, and it's now back on my desk.
Oh, lucky you.
Well, at least you're familiar with it.
Oh, yes.
At least he wrote it and was receptive to do
He was,
that.
yes. Yeah. So he acknowledged that he needed to do that. Now, I know that listeners will be thinking about AI too, but it's really early days in its usage in academia, and it's much harder to spot than plagiarism. And if an author goes away and asks ChatGPT to write a whole article for them, that's pretty much impossible to spot if it doesn't have the ChatGPT prompt at the beginning, which I know has happened.
Yeah.
And you can see it if they've taken little chunks and put those through AI, because again, the writing style will change. And occasionally, if you're really up on subject matter, you might spot fake references, but you'd need to know a particular scholar's reference list incredibly well to do that. Yeah. It's a big unknown at the moment.
It really is, isn't it?
And I think one of the other difficulties as well is that when publishers or universities run work through AI detectors, it's flagging human written stuff as being 60, 70, 80% AI generated. Which is a real worry for authors. And I don't know about you, Hester, but I've certainly seen in conversations online about people actually running their work through an AI detector and then dumbing it down before they submit it to remove language that it is flagged. So certain words, and apparently M dashes apparently are a sign of AI. Who'd have thought it?
Wow. Isn't it a good thing that we use N dashes over here?
I know, exactly. But yeah.
Or not at the end of an interrupted sentence. Dialogue.
Thus speaks the fiction editor,
It is. It's so human written work is being misidentified.
Yes.
By probably AI checkers.
They're very, very unreliable.
Yeah. And of course it's going the other way. That AI work is getting through as being okay, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't think we have an answer at the moment.
No.
Yeah.
I think there's no question that the AI will continue to improve. I'm also reading in other places that it's actually levelling off its levels of improvement. It's not going to keep getting better as quickly as it has recently, but it's tapering off, and it may not have all the answers that people think it might. So
we shall see.
We'll see.
We shall see.
We'll have to come back and have that conversation again in a year or two's time.
Exactly. That's a very good point.
Absolutely. It will be really interesting. It's always interesting to explore topics and then go back to them a year or two later with the same people and see what's changed. We might have you back loads, Hester. Anyway. That's it from us. Thank you once again for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, so if you'd like to help support the Editing Podcast, we've got a couple of options for you. The first is that you can tip us with a one-off donation of your choosing.
Or you can join our Patreon community. All our patrons get exclusive access to a huge batch of transcripts.
Both the links are in the show notes. In the meantime, she's been Louise.
And she's been Denise. And she's been Hester. Join us again soon. Bye.
Bye.